You chose the wrong bride. She said it standing straight, dust on her boots, a crumpled letter pressed against her chest, and every person on that platform went dead silent. Caleb Anderson had waited 6 months for a wife. What stepped off that train was something he never expected, a stranger delivering the news that his future had just been canceled. He could have walked away. He could have cursed the whole arrangement. Instead, he looked at the woman brave enough to ride 1,000 miles just to tell him the truth, and he said, "Then it's my honor to meet you. If you've ever been left behind and still chose to stand tall, this story is for you. Subscribe, watch until the end, and tell us in the comments what city are you watching from. The train was 12 minutes late, and Caleb Anderson had counted every one of them. He stood at the far end of the Hargrove Station platform with a bundle of wildflowers in his left hand. Yellow ones because he'd been told in a letter months ago that yellow was a color that felt like hope. He'd picked them himself that morning before sunrise, cutting them from the edge of the creek where they grew stubborn and bright through the frost. It had felt like the right thing to do. Now, standing in the cold with the flowers going limp in his grip, he wasn't so sure about much of anything. I was 32 years old. He had 40 head of cattle, a drafty farmhouse, and a stretch of Montana land that his father had broken his back building. He had calluses on both hands and a debt that had been growing like a weed since the hard winter 2 years ago. What he did not have was a partner. What he had been hoping for the past 6 months was that Clara Weston of Dodge City, Kansas, might be willing to become one. The letters had been good. Not romantic exactly. Caleb wasn't built for flowery language, and it seemed Clara wasn't either. They'd written plainly. She'd asked about the land. He'd asked about her family. She'd said she wasn't afraid of hard work, and he'd believed her. He'd written back that the winters were brutal, but the summers made up for it. She hadn't run from that. By the 4th letter, he'd felt something settle in his chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. Something solid. Something he could build on. He had not received a 5th letter. He told himself she'd been busy. He told himself the mail was slow. He told himself a lot of things in the 2 months of silence that followed, and then he'd gone ahead and bought the train ticket information and written one final letter confirming he'd be at Hargrove Station on the 3rd Saturday of November, holding yellow flowers waiting. He was holding those flowers now. The locomotive hissed and shuddered to a stop. Steam billowed across the platform, and Caleb took one step forward, scanning the windows, watching the doors. The first passengers off were a man in a business coat. 2 older women traveling together, a family with 3 children who tumbled down the steps like they'd been cooped up for days. Caleb watched each one pass. His jaw was set. His eyes moved steadily. Then the last door at the far end of the car opened and a woman stepped down. She was young, younger than he'd expected, maybe mid-20s. She wore a brown coat that had seen better seasons, the hem frayed at the bottom and the collar turned up against the cold. Her boots were dusty in a way that said she'd been traveling for more than just the last leg of the trip. She carried a single canvas bag over one shoulder, and in her right hand she held something pressed tight, a folded piece of paper, or maybe an envelope. Her eyes swept the platform with the kind of alertness that didn't come from confidence so much as habit. Like someone who'd learned early that you had to see a room before a room saw you. She spotted him before he'd fully registered her. She walked directly toward him, not hurrying, but not hesitating either, and she stopped 3 feet away and looked him square in the face. She had dark eyes, steady and clear, and a mouth that was pressed into a line that said, whatever she was about to say, she'd already rehearsed it several times on the train and had decided plain was better than soft. "You're Caleb Anderson." It wasn't a question. "I am." He glanced once at the door she'd come through, then back to her. "I'm waiting for Clara Weston." She held the envelope out toward him. "I know. She asked me to bring you this." The platform seemed to tilt slightly. Caleb looked at the envelope. He didn't take it right away. Something in the steadiness of this woman's gaze, the way she was holding her spine straight, like it cost her something, made him slow down. "She asked you to bring it." "Yes." "She's not coming." "No." He reached out and took the envelope. He didn't open it. He just held it in the same hand as the flowers, the paper against the stems. and looked at this woman standing in front of him like she was waiting for him to fall apart so she could catalog the damage and get on the next train west. "How far did you come?" he asked. She blinked. That apparently had not been in her rehearsal. "What?" "To bring this." He lifted the envelope slightly. "How far?" She studied him for the moment, like she was deciding whether the question was a trap. "Came up from Billings, but I'd been traveling since Kansas. 4 days counting layovers." 4 days. He looked at the envelope again. "She sent you 4 days' worth of travel to hand me a letter. She didn't want to send it through the post." There was something in her voice, not apology, but a careful kind of fairness. "She thought you deserved to hear it from a person, not a piece of paper sitting in a mailbox." "And you agreed to do it." "I owed her a favor." Caleb nodded slowly. Around them, the platform had mostly emptied. The station agent had gone back inside. A couple of men who'd been loading freight had moved down the far end of the platform. But Caleb was aware, in the peripheral way of a man who'd grown up in a small town, that there were still eyes on him. There were always eyes on him lately. His cousin had made sure of that. He opened the envelope. The letter was short. Clara's handwriting was neat, controlled the handwriting of someone who thought carefully before they committed a word to paper. "Dear Mr. Anderson, I am sorry to tell you this way. I have reconsidered our arrangement and cannot in good conscience proceed. I wish you nothing but good fortune in the future. Sincerely, Clara Weston." He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his coat pocket. The woman standing in front of him had not moved. She was watching him with those dark, level eyes, and she looked like she was prepared for several different outcomes: anger, grief, humiliation, and had already decided how she'd respond to each one. "You chose the wrong bride," she said. Her voice was quieter now, and there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Not softness exactly. More like the acknowledgement that this was a hard thing, and she wasn't going to pretend it wasn't. "That's what she said to tell you. That you'd built up something in your head based on letters, and that the real her would only disappoint you. So." She shifted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. "She said to tell you that." Caleb was quiet for a long moment. A gust of wind came off the mountains and moved through the platform, and he felt the cold of it along the back of his neck. "What's your name?" he asked. Again the slight hesitation. "Lily. Lily Bennett. Miss Bennett." He looked at her steadily. "You rode 4 days through November to stand on a train platform in a town you don't know and tell a stranger that his future just changed. Most people wouldn't do that. Most people would have put the letter in the mail and left it at that." Lily said nothing. Her jaw moved slightly like she was chewing on a response and hadn't decided if it was worth saying. "Then it's my honor to meet you," he said. He meant it plainly, without performance. "Whatever Clara's reasons were, you didn't deserve to be the one carrying them, and you came anyway." The station agent's door opened behind him. Somebody called out a schedule. The wind moved again. Lily Bennett stood on that platform and looked at Caleb Anderson with an expression he couldn't quite read, something between suspicion and the very first edge of being surprised by something, and after a moment she said quietly, "You're not what I expected." "No," he agreed. "Neither are you." He offered to carry her bag to the hotel. She told him she didn't need help carrying a bag. He said he wasn't offering because he thought she needed it. He was offering because it was cold, and she'd been carrying it for 4 days, and he was standing right there. She looked at him for a moment, then held it out. They walked the 3 blocks to the Hargrove Inn without saying much. The town was small, a main street with a general store, a feed supply, a land office that Caleb had reason to know well, and the inn at the far end. A few people nodded at Caleb as they passed. A few looked at Lily with open curiosity. One woman, Margaret Yates, who ran the alterations shop, and who had Caleb knew already, told half the town about the mail-order bride arrangement, stopped on the boardwalk and stared with transparent interest. Caleb nodded at her and kept walking. At the inn, he put Lily's bag down on the step and turned to face her. "Where are you headed after this?" "Cheyenne," she said. "I have work waiting." "What kind of work?" She gave him a look that said that was more than she'd planned to share, but she answered anyway. "I managed a ranch operation outside of Billings for 2 years. Foreman moved on, family sold the land. I've been picking up work since then. A brief pause. There's a cattle operation in Wyoming that's interested. Caleb absorbed that. You know cattle. I know cattle, horses, feed rotation, waterline maintenance, and how to keep books in winter when the hands are restless and the numbers don't want to add up. She said it without bravado, just information. Why? He looked out at the street for a moment, then back at her. When's your train to Cheyenne? Monday. It's Saturday. I know what day it is. Might be, he said carefully, that I have a situation on my land that I could use a set of experienced eyes on. For 2 days. I'd pay for your time and a return ticket south if that's where you're eventually heading. Lily looked at him, the same way she'd looked at him on the platform, like she was cataloging the possible angles of the thing, checking it for traps. You just got turned down by a mail-order bride in front of a train station full of people, she said flatly. And your first move is to hire the woman who delivered the news. My first move, he said, is to solve a problem on my ranch before winter sets in. You happen to have the experience I need. That's the whole of it. She was quiet for a long beat. What's the problem? Water rights dispute, and a cousin who thinks he's smarter than he is. He paused. Are those related? Yes. Lily looked at him for another moment, then she picked up her bag from the step. I'll think about it tonight, she said. Ask me again in the morning. He asked her again in the morning. She said yes. They rode out to Anderson Valley on a borrowed wagon because Caleb's was in for a wheel repair, and for most of the hour-long trip they didn't speak much. Lily watched the land. Caleb watched the road. Occasionally one of them would say something practical. He'd point out a landmark, she'd ask a question about the soil. It was the kind of conversation that happens between two people who are both used to working, who respect the fact that talking for its own sake burns energy that could go somewhere useful. When the farmhouse came into view, Lily was quiet for a moment, taking it in. The house itself was solid 2 stories, good timber, nothing fancy. The barn was larger than the house, which was as it should be on a working ranch. There was a bunkhouse to the east, a feed storage structure, a well. The fencing was mostly in good repair, with one section along the north pasture that clearly needed attention. The whole property sat in the elbow of a low ridge, sheltered from the worst of the wind. How much land? Lily asked. 340 acres. My father bought the first 100, I added the rest over 10 years. He kept his eyes on the road. The water source is a creek that runs through the eastern pasture, feeds into a secondary draw that 2 neighboring properties also use. And your cousin? Caleb's expression didn't change much, but something tightened around the edges. Everett Holt, my mother's sister's son. He's been buying up land in this county for 3 years. Holds paper on 6 properties now, including the McCready place right north of my eastern fence line. A pause. He's been telling people the creek shifts seasonally to favor his land. That my east pasture only gets reliable water because of his goodwill. Lily turned to look at him. That's not a water rights dispute. That's a setup. Yes. He's trying to establish a dependency claim. That's my read. And he needs something from you for it to hold. Caleb glanced at her sideways. He needs me to be struggling. Financially, operationally, both. A man who's barely keeping his herd alive through winter and who can't pay his hands on time looks like a man who needs a favor. A man who needs a favor becomes a man who owes one. Lily turned back to the road. After a moment, she said, How bad is the actual financial situation? He could have softened it. He didn't. Bad enough, not unrecoverable. But it has to be managed carefully through winter or spring becomes a different conversation. How much do you owe? $460 spread across 2 notes. One comes due in February. She was quiet, working something through. What are your cattle numbers? 38 head right now, expecting 6 to 8 calves in spring if the season's good. Feed stores. Enough for the herd through February. After that, I need to either sell some animals or get credit on more feed. Hands. 2 full-time, 1 part-time who comes in for heavy work. Lily nodded slowly. The wagon rolled through the gate and into the yard, and she looked around at the whole of it, The house, the barn, the fence line, the winter-brown grass of the near pasture. You don't need a wife, she said finally. You need a plan. Caleb pulled the wagon to a stop and sat with that for a moment. Those things aren't always separate. She got down from the wagon before he could offer to help and stood in the yard with her hands on her hips, looking east toward where the creek would be. Show me the water source. They walked the creek line for 2 hours. Lily asked questions the whole time about flow rate in summer versus fall, about where the secondary draw ran, about the legal description of the eastern boundary, about whether Caleb had any documentation of the creek's original course when his father bought the land. She walked with her boots going into the mud at the bank, without seeming to notice or care, crouching down to look at the waterline markers, standing up to sight along the tree line. Caleb answered everything he could, and was honest when he couldn't. He had some of the documents she was asking about. Not all of them. Some were in a box in the house that he hadn't gone through in years. Some he wasn't sure existed. They exist, she said, straightening up from a close examination of a rock formation on the east bank. If your father purchased the water rights with the land, and in 1861 in Montana Territory, he almost certainly did, there will be a deed addendum, either in your files or in the county records office. She looked at him. Have you been to the county records office? Not for this. Everett Holt has. He looked at her. How do you know that? Because that's what I'd do. She brushed the mud from her fingers on the tall grass at the bank's edge. He knows what's in those records. If there was anything in there that cleanly defeated your claim, he'd have moved already. The fact that he hasn't moved yet, that he's building a narrative instead of filing a legal action, means the documentary record is either ambiguous or it favors you. He needs you weak before he can make his move. She paused. You're not as weak as he needs you to be yet, but you're close. Caleb stood at the creek bank and looked at the water moving south and thought about the past 2 years. The bad winter, the feed bills, the note at the bank, the way Everett had started showing up at the feed store when Caleb was there, always friendly, always just so happening to mention things. The way the other ranchers in the valley had started watching Caleb sideways, like they were waiting to see which way a tree was going to fall. You figured that out in 2 hours, he said. I've seen it before. She turned and started walking back along the bank toward the house. The Billings operation. I managed the family sold because they thought they had no options. They had options. They just couldn't see them from inside the problem. She paused without looking back. You're inside the problem. He fell into step beside her. And you're not. Not yet. She had meant to leave Monday. By Sunday evening, she had gone through the box of documents in the house, organized the financial records on the kitchen table, written a list of what was missing and where it was likely to be found, and eaten 2 meals that she'd made from what was in the kitchen, because she'd found the kitchen and its relationship to actual cooking concerning Caleb's ranch hand. A quiet man named Hector, who had worked the property for 4 years and who seemed to decide within the first hour that Lily was a person worth paying attention to, had shown her the bunkhouse records and confirmed the feed store credit situation. By Sunday evening, the picture was clear. Not hopeless, but close to the line. Lily sat at the kitchen table with the papers in front of her, and Caleb across from her with his hands wrapped around a coffee cup, and she said, I'll stay 30 days. He looked at her over the cup. What changes in 30 days? If we move fast, we can get the county records pulled before December. We can restructure the feed arrangement with 2 suppliers instead of 1, which drops your per-unit cost and removes the single point of pressure Everett can apply if he has any relationship with your current supplier, which I suspect he does. She paused. We get your cattle count documented and your spring projections formalized. When February comes and the note is due, you walk into that bank with numbers that make sense, not a man's word against a bad season. Caleb was quiet for a moment. And if it doesn't work, then you're in the same position you'd be in if I left Monday, minus 30 days. He looked at her. Why would you do this? You have a job waiting in Cheyenne. Lily looked down at the papers on the table. It was a longer beat of silence than she'd allowed herself so far. Something moved in her face, not softness exactly, but something adjacent to it. The shape of a history she wasn't planning to give him. "My father had a ranch," she said. "Smaller than this. We lost it when I was 19. Not because we were bad at ranching. Because someone with more money and more patience than us decided they wanted what we'd built." She looked back up at him. "I know what it looks like from the inside. And I know what it costs to lose it." Caleb didn't say he was sorry. She would not have wanted that. He just nodded once and said, 30 days. 30 days, she confirmed. She cleared the coffee cups and went back to the papers, and Caleb sat across from her in the lamplight of the kitchen. At the end of a day he had never anticipated, and thought about how strange it was that the worst news he'd received in years had come in the hands of the one person who might actually help him save what he'd built. The first week was work. Lily was at the barn before Caleb each morning, not because she was trying to prove anything, but because she woke up early and couldn't sleep in unfamiliar places. And work was the most useful thing she could think to do with the extra hour. She took stock of the animals, checked the water lines, walked the fences. She had a way of moving through a work task that was efficient without being cold about it. She noticed things and dealt with them and moved on without making a production out of any of it. Caleb's two full-time hands, Hector and a younger man named Davis, who was 20 years old and trying very hard to seem like he'd seen everything, watched her with a kind of careful attention that slowly converted into respect. Not because she demanded it, because she earned it the way it's always earned, by knowing what she was doing and doing it without excuses. On Wednesday of the first week, Davis made a remark not unkindly, but without thinking about whether she'd be better off in the kitchen than at the fence line. Lily finished stapling the broken section of wire she'd been working on, picked up the stapler and her kit, and looked at Davis with those level dark eyes. "I've managed operations with 40 hands, 600 head, and a hay output that fed 2 counties through a drought year," she said. "I'll do the fence line. You worry about keeping up." Davis worried about keeping up. He also never made that remark again, or anything like it. Hector, who had watched the whole exchange from 12 feet away, went back to his work with what might in the right light have been a small smile. On Saturday of the first week, Everett Holt came to the ranch. Caleb saw the horse and rider from the far pasture and stood for a moment watching, then walked in from the field at a pace that was unhurried but deliberate. Lily was at the barn working through the feed inventory with Hector when she heard the approach and came out to stand just outside the barn door. Everett Holt was 40 years old and had the look of a man who had decided some years back that prosperity was a matter of willingness more than work. He was not unpleasant to look at: broad shoulders, good coat, a hat that cost more than most men spent on boots. He had a way of smiling that used most of his face and none of his eyes. He swung down from his horse and spread his arms in a gesture of warm greeting that did not land on Caleb's face the way Everett seemed to intend it. "Caleb, good to see you, cousin." He looked around the yard with the transparent assessment of a man inventorying something. His gaze landed on Lily. "And who's this Lily Bennett?" Caleb stopped 3 feet from his cousin. "She's helping me with the ranch operations for the next month." Everett's eyebrows went up in an expression of pleasant surprise that was doing a lot of work. "Is that right? I'd heard you're—" He paused, tilting his head with a smile that was almost sympathetic. "Well, I'd heard the arrangement with the Weston woman fell through. I'm sorry about that, Caleb. Truly." "We're fine," Caleb said. Of course, of course." Everett looked at Lily again. "You have experience with ranching, Miss Bennett." "Some," Lily said. Everett smiled at the understatement, as if he'd caught her in something. "Well, I'm sure that's helpful." "Caleb, I actually came by because I wanted to talk to you about the Eastern water situation. I've been doing some thinking, and I believe there may be a way to formalize the arrangement that works for both our properties. Something neighborly, you understand. A shared use agreement that acknowledges the natural flow pattern." "I've got someone looking at the county records," Caleb said. Everett's smile stayed in place, but something behind it shifted. "Do you?" "I do." "Well, that's thorough of you." A pause. "Expensive, though. Legal work. I imagine with things the way they are." "We'll manage," Caleb said. Everett looked at him for a moment, then at Lily, then back at Caleb. The smile warmed back up like a furnace being fed. "Well, the offer stands whenever you want to talk." He put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder, a gesture that looked friendly and felt like something else entirely. "You know I want what's best for the family." He remounted and rode out. Caleb watched him go without moving until the horse was through the gate. "He knows we're looking at the records," Lily said quietly from behind him. "Yes. He'll move faster now." "I know." A pause. "So will we," she said. The county records office was in the town of Millbrook, 14 miles east. Caleb and Lily made the trip on Tuesday, leaving before first light Lily with a notebook and the list she'd compiled from his files. The clerk, a precise older man named Albright, who seemed to take personal offense at disorder of any kind, was at first reluctant to pull what they were asking for. It was a long record. It went back to territorial days. It required finding the original land survey documents from 1861. Lily set her notebook on the counter and looked at him. The survey would have been filed under the Anderson Land Grant Second Quarter Section, Water Addendum, filed no later than December of 1861, based on the purchase date. "I'd also like to see any claim amendments filed in the last 3 years on the adjacent McCready parcel." Albright looked at her for a moment. Then he went and got the records. They spent 4 hours in that office. By the time they were done, Lily had filled 11 pages of the notebook. Caleb sat across the table from her and watched her work. The systematic way she moved through documents, the way she noted what mattered and cross-referenced it against the next page. The absolute lack of hurry in how she operated, even when he could see in the set of her shoulders that what she was finding mattered. When she finally put the pen down, she sat back and looked at him. "The water rights are yours," she said. "Clean and documented. The original survey establishes the creek as an appurtenance of the Anderson land going back to the initial grant." A pause. "Everett filed a claim amendment on the McCready parcel 18 months ago. He tried to include a water access provision in the amendment. The clerk rejected it because it conflicted with the existing Anderson survey. He has no record of appeal." Caleb was still for a moment. "He tried once and it didn't work." And rather than appeal, which would create a documented legal record, he shifted strategies. Build a narrative. Establish dependency. Wait for you to be desperate enough to sign something voluntarily that the courts wouldn't give him. She tapped the notebook. "He needed you to believe you had no legal standing, because legally you do." Caleb looked at the notebook, then at the window, where the November light was coming gray and cold through the glass, then at Lily. "You just saved my ranch," he said. "Not yet," she said. "We saved the documentation. There's still February." He bought her a cup of coffee at the diner across from the records office, and for the first time in the 2 weeks she'd been at the ranch, they sat across from each other with nothing in particular to do except drink the coffee. It was strange, comfortable in a way that surprised him, and disquieting for the same reason. "What happened to your father's ranch?" he said. Not a question exactly, more an opening if she wanted to take it. She held the cup in both hands and looked at the table for a moment. "Mortgage got called early. Drought year. They said it was legal. Maybe it was. Maybe not. By the time we had the money together to fight it, we didn't have the land." A pause. "My father never worked again after that. Not real work. He just—" She stopped. Started again differently. "Some things break people." "He broke." "He did. And you didn't." She looked up at him, then those dark eyes direct and unsentimental. "I got angry instead." "I thought about that." "That's better." "Sometimes." She looked back down at the coffee. "Sometimes anger just makes you harder and lonelier, and you don't even notice until you're 4 days on a train to a stranger's town, and you've spent the whole trip rehearsing what you're going to say." He was quiet. Outside, a wagon rattled past on the main street. "You could have mailed it," he said. "Clara asked me not to." "You could have said no." She considered that, lifted the cup, set it back down. "She's a good person, Clara. Just not right for what you're asking. She knew that and you didn't. It seemed like you deserved to know. So you came. So I came. He looked at her across the table in the gray November light of a diner in a small Montana town and felt something that he didn't have the right word for. Yet something that was quieter than the possibility Clara's letters had offered, but more solid, more grounded, like the difference between a map of a place and actually standing in it. 30 days, he said. She met his eyes. Something moved in her face, brief guarded but there. 30 days, she said, and she finished her coffee, set the cup down on the scratched diner table with a quiet finality that Caleb recognized. It was the sound of a decision being closed, not opened. And for a moment, neither of them said anything, and the silence between them was the particular kind that happens when two people have just shared something real and are not yet sure what to do with it. The ride back to Anderson Valley took longer than the ride out. Not because the road was worse, but because the light was going, and Caleb was thinking, and Lily was thinking, and neither of them was in a hurry to break whatever had settled between them in that diner. The 11 pages of notebook sat between them on the wagon bench like a third passenger. And every few miles, one of them would say something practical about the records, about the February note, about what needed to happen next, and the other would answer, and then they'd go quiet again. It was not uncomfortable. That was the part Caleb kept coming back to. It should have been uncomfortable. A woman he'd known 2 weeks sitting close enough that their shoulders occasionally touched on a rough section of road, and it wasn't uncomfortable at all. That in itself felt like something worth paying attention to. They got back to the ranch as the last of the light was leaving the sky. Hector had kept the stoves going and left a pot of something on the kitchen range. Davis had done the evening feeding without being asked, and left a note on the barn door that said in handwriting that suggested he'd worked at it. Everything squared away. D. Lily read the note, then looked at the barn door, then at Caleb. He's learning, she said. He's trying, Caleb said. That counts. She folded the note and put it in her coat pocket and went inside to work on the numbers, and Caleb stood in the yard for a minute in the cold dark and looked up at the stars coming out over the ridge and thought about how a man's life could shift direction in the space of 2 weeks, and he might not even feel it turning until it had already gone. He went inside and got to work. The plan they built over the next 3 days was not complicated, but it had to be exact. Lily laid it out on paper, and Caleb went through it line by line asking questions and pushing back where something didn't sit right, and she answered every challenge directly and revised where he made a valid point and held firm where she didn't. It was the most functional disagreement he'd had with anyone in years. He'd grown so accustomed to people either caving immediately or digging in from pride that having someone actually engage, think it through, come back at him with reasoning felt like a kind of relief he hadn't known he was missing. The plan had 3 parts. First, pull the documentary record from Millbrook and have it reviewed by an attorney named Garfield in Helena, who had handled water rights cases before, and who Lily had found through a contact from her time in Billings. Second, restructure the feed arrangements, moving to split purchasing between the Hargrove feed store and a supplier in Millbrook that Everett had no known relationship with, which cut their exposure by roughly a third and removed the single point of pressure Lily had identified. Third, call the February note due date by going to the bank proactively, not waiting for the bank to come to them with the full documentation and a clear projection of spring income based on realistic cattle numbers. Banks don't like surprises, Lily said. They like men who know their numbers and come in before things are critical. You go to them in February looking like a man managing a problem. You go to them in January looking like a man who saw the problem coming. Those are different conversations. Caleb absorbed that. I've never gone to the bank before the note was due. I know. Most ranchers don't. That's why the banks own most ranches within 2 generations. It landed harder than she'd probably intended. Caleb thought about his father, about the notes his father had carried, about the box of documents in the house that he'd never fully gone through, because going through them felt like an accounting of everything he still hadn't managed to fix. You went through the whole box, he said. The whole box, she confirmed. And she looked at him steadily. Your father was a better manager than you've given yourself credit for. The land is clean. The original debt structure was reasonable. What's hurt you is 2 bad seasons and a feed cost increase that hit you the same year as the first bad season, which is the worst possible timing. That's circumstance, not failure. A pause. People confuse those things. Caleb looked at the table. You sound like you've needed to hear that yourself. Lily was quiet for a moment. Maybe once, she said. Yes. He didn't push it. She didn't offer. They went back to the numbers. On Friday of the second week, Caleb rode into Hargrove for supplies and came back with the specific information that Everett Holt had been in the land office for most of Thursday morning. He'd asked apparently casually about the process for filing a dependency amendment on an existing water rights claim. The land office clerk, a young woman named Alice, who had no reason to protect Everett's privacy, had mentioned it to 3 people by noon. Lily received this information with a flat expression and then stood up from the kitchen table and put her coat on. Where are you going? Caleb asked. To write a letter to Garfield and Helena. It's 7 o'clock. The letter won't care. She picked up her pen and her notebook. He tried a legal route 18 months ago and it failed. He's looking at it again, which means he knows we pulled the county records, and he's trying to find a way around the documentation before we can file anything formal. He needs to move before we do. She looked at Caleb. We need to move first. How fast can Garfield respond? If I write tonight and you write it to the stage in the morning, he could have it by Monday. I'm going to ask for a telegraphed response with his assessment by Wednesday. That gives us time to decide on formal filing before Everett can get anything in front of a clerk. Caleb picked up his coat. I'll get the lamp. She looked at him. You don't have to stay up. I know, he said. I'm staying up. They worked until past midnight. Caleb made coffee, and Lily wrote the letter and read sections of it aloud for his input, and he sat across from her and told her where the language felt wrong or where he needed clarification, and she revised as she went. It was the kind of work that strips away the performance of a person and leaves just the working core of them, and somewhere around 10 o'clock, with the lamp burning low between them and the wind moving outside. Caleb looked up from the document and found Lily watching him with an expression she hadn't meant for him to see, something open and careful, like a door that had been cracked just enough to let the light through. She looked back down immediately. He looked back down. Neither of them said anything about it. The letter went out on Saturday morning's stage. By Tuesday, a telegram arrived from Garfield's office. Lily read it at the post counter, then folded it and put it in her coat. And when she got back to the ranch, her face had that precise stillness it got when something mattered. Well, Caleb asked. He says the Anderson survey documentation is solid. The 1861 addendum is exactly what we need. He also says... She paused briefly, reading from the telegram. That Everett Holt filed a preliminary inquiry with the Helena Land Board last week, citing seasonal flow variance as grounds for a shared use review. She looked up. He moved faster than I expected. Caleb felt something tighten in his chest. How bad? It's a preliminary inquiry. It's not a filing. He's testing whether he can get traction before committing to a legal action he might lose. She folded the telegram again. Garfield says if we file a formal rights confirmation within the next 3 weeks, Everett's inquiry becomes moot. He'll have no grounds to pursue the variance claim because the confirmed rights will supersede it. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Can Garfield do that from Helena? He needs to come here. He needs to review the originals, not copies, and file directly with the county court. She met his eyes. He'll come if we ask him. He'll need a fee, which I know you don't have in excess, but he'll take partial payment and the rest on resolution. He's done it before. Caleb stood very still for a moment, then he nodded. Send the telegram. Tell him to come. Lily turned back to the post counter and picked up a form. Behind her. Caleb let out a slow breath that he'd been holding for longer than 2 weeks. On Thursday of the second week, Everett came back. This time he didn't come alone. He brought a man named Colton, who worked as his property manager and who had a way of standing slightly behind Everett's right shoulder that communicated without ever saying it that he was there to be a physical fact in a room. Caleb had seen the arrangement before. It was a technique, not a threat exactly, just a reminder that Everett had people and resources, and you should keep that in mind while you were talking. Caleb let them into the yard and did not invite them inside. "I heard you've been in the county records," Everett said. His voice was still pleasant, but the warmth had a thin quality to it now, like fabric that's been washed too many times. "I have," Caleb said. "Found what you were looking for. Found what was there." Everett tilted his head slightly. "I'm going to be straight with you, Caleb, because we're family, and I think you deserve that." He paused to let the word family sit for a moment. The situation with the Eastern Water is more complicated than old survey documents can capture. The natural hydrology of that creek has changed over 20 years. What the paper says and what the land actually does are two different things, and a court is going to look at both. "Let them look," Caleb said. "A beat. That'll be expensive." "It will. And if the February note comes due while you're in the middle of a legal process, then I'll handle the February note while I'm in the middle of a legal process." Everett looked at him for a moment, and then his gaze moved past Caleb's shoulder to where Lily had come out of the barn and was standing at the open door, making no move toward them, but making no move away either. Just there. Present. Watching. Something moved in Everett's expression, something calculating and cold, that the warmth had been doing a very good job of covering. "Miss Bennett," he said. "Still here." "Still here," Lily said, helping Caleb with ranch operations. The pause was small, but pointed freighted with a specific implication that he was deploying with great care. Lily walked from the barn toward them with an even, unhurried stride. She stopped beside Caleb and looked at Everett Holt with those level dark eyes that did not give him anything to work with. "Mr. Holt," she said, "you filed a preliminary inquiry with the Helena Land Board last week on the basis of seasonal flow variance." Everett's pleasant face did something careful. "I don't know where you're—" "Garfield and Helena," she said. "He's very thorough. The inquiry was filed under your property manager's name." She glanced briefly at Colton, "which is a way of keeping distance from it if it doesn't go the way you want. But it still shows up in the board's intake record. I have a copy." She paused. "We'll be filing a formal rights confirmation with the county court within 3 weeks, which will render the inquiry moot. I wanted you to know as a courtesy." The silence that followed was the particular kind that falls when someone in a conversation has just played a card the other person didn't know they held. Everett looked at Lily, then at Caleb. The warm smile was still on his face, but it had become something else entirely, a mask wearing the shape of a smile, nothing underneath it recognizable as goodwill. "You've been busy," Everett said. His voice had dropped into something quieter and more deliberate. "We have," Caleb said. Another silence. Everett looked out at the pasture, then back at them both. "I'd reconsider the cost of what you're starting," he said finally. "Legal fights are long. They're expensive, and they have a way of surfacing things that people would prefer stayed quiet." He let that sit for a moment. For everyone involved. Caleb took one step forward. Just one. "Get off my land, Everett." Everett held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the deliberate courtesy of a man who wants you to know that he's choosing to leave, not being made to. He and Colton remounted and rode out through the gate and down the road without looking back. Lily watched them go. "He's going to go after you differently now," she said. "I know. He's not going to fight the water rights directly. He's going to go after your credibility, your ability to pay, something personal." She turned to look at Caleb. "He'll look for anything that makes you seem like you're not managing this ranch properly. That makes the February note look like more than bad luck." A pause. "He'll look at me." Caleb met her eyes. "What do you mean?" Lily was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, it was with the careful precision of someone laying out a fact they'd rather not have to state. "A woman traveling alone, no family visible, showing up on a mail-order bride train, living and working on a bachelor rancher's property." She paused. "In 1882, Montana, that story writes itself in a way that neither of us would want." The reality of it settled over Caleb like cold water. "He'll use it against you." "He'll use it against you through me," she said. He'll say you brought in a woman under false pretenses, that the living arrangement is improper, that any business decisions made while she's on the property are compromised. She folded her arms across her chest. It's not about me. It's about discrediting your judgment, making the bank, the county court, anyone who matters, making them look at you sideways. He doesn't know yet that you went to the records office with me. He will by Monday. Caleb thought about that, about the way Everett's gaze had moved to Lily, the way he'd paused on the word operations with that small, deliberate weight. He'd been calculating it already. He'd been looking at Lily and seeing a tool. What do we do? Caleb asked. Lily looked at him steadily. There was something in her face that she was working to keep level, not fear exactly, but the recognition of a familiar kind of danger, the kind that doesn't come with fists, but with whispers and implications, and the slow erosion of a person standing in a community that already watches them sideways. We move faster than he does, she said, and we don't give him anything to work with. What she meant, he understood, was that they needed to be careful. Careful about how they appeared. Careful about the story the town told when they looked at Anderson Valley. He understood it, and he also felt something else alongside the understanding, a resistance to it, a frustration that a woman who had ridden 4 days to do the right thing and had spent 2 weeks saving his ranch should have to calculate how visible she was allowed to be. It's not fair, he said. The words came out rougher than he intended. Lily looked at him with an expression that was almost gentle, which was a thing he hadn't seen on her face before. No, she said. It's not. A pause. But it's how it is. And I've learned that the way you fight how it is by being so solid, so documented, so clearly legitimate that there's nothing for anyone to get a grip on. She went back inside. Caleb stood in the yard and thought about fairness, and about the gap between what was fair and what was, and about the particular kind of person it takes to navigate that gap without bitterness, eating them hollow. Hector came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw Caleb's face. Everett Holt, he asked. Yes. He going to be trouble? Yes. Hector was quiet for a moment, turning his hat in his hands. He was not an expressive man. Hector 4 years at Anderson Valley, and Caleb had learned to read him through small signals rather than statements. What his face was doing right now was something Caleb hadn't seen often: deliberate, decided. You know, Hector said carefully, I've worked 3 ranches in this county. Holt's come after 2 of them. Caleb looked at him. And the first one they folded before the fight got started. Man thought he had no one behind him. Hector put his hat back on. The second one held. Neighbors stood up. 3 ranchers testified at the county hearing. Holt backed down. He paused. The difference wasn't the land or the money. It was whether a man was standing alone or standing with people. He went back around the corner of the barn. Caleb thought about that for a long time. That evening at dinner, which Lily cooked with the same matter-of-fact efficiency she brought to everything, because the kitchen situation continued to concern her. Caleb told her what Hector had said. She listened without interrupting, spooning beans onto plates without looking up. When he finished, she set the pot down and looked at him. Who are the neighboring ranchers? Closest would be the McCready place, but Everett owns that now. North of that, the Callahan family. They've been here 20 years. East is the Sorensen operation, smaller, maybe 120 acres. He paused. There's also the Watkins family. They had a water dispute with Everett 3 years ago. Came to nothing. Everett backed off before it got legal, but it left bad feeling. Lily sat down. Have you talked to any of them about what's happening? No. Why not? He considered the question honestly. I suppose I was... He stopped. I suppose I thought it was mine to handle. Lily looked at him with that expression she got when she was being patient with something she found genuinely frustrating. Caleb, Everett Holt has been building a network in this county for 3 years. He owns 6 properties. He has relationships at the land board and probably at the bank. He doesn't operate alone. She put her fork down. You can't fight a network by yourself. I'm not by myself. The words came out before he'd fully thought them through, and when they landed there was a small silence that neither of them looked at directly. No, Lily said after a moment. Her voice was even. You're not. She picked her fork back up. Which is exactly why we need to talk to the Watkins family and the Callahans before the week is out. Caleb nodded slowly. Outside the kitchen window, the November dark had settled fully, and the temperature was dropping, and somewhere up on the ridge, a coyote started and then stopped. I'll ride to the Callahans in the morning, he said. I'll come with you. He looked at her across the table. She was already eating again, focused on the food, but her jaw was set in that particular way she had when she'd decided something and wasn't interested in discussing whether it was decided. All right, he said. She didn't look up, but something in the line of her shoulders relaxed just slightly. The next morning, before they left for the Callahans, something happened that changed the shape of everything. Davis came to the house at first light, with a look on his face that Caleb recognized as the look of a young man who had learned something he didn't want to know. There's talk in town, Davis said. He was standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, turning it around and around, the same way Hector had done, which told Caleb that what was coming had already been discussed between them, and that neither of them had liked it. About Miss Bennet. Lily looked up from the table where she was reviewing the Garfield correspondence. Her face was still. Davis looked at the floor. Everett Holt was at the feed store yesterday evening, talking to some of the men. He paused. He was saying she isn't who she says she is. That she arrived on the mail-order bride train, but she isn't the woman you arranged to marry. That she's a stranger, who he was saying she saw an opportunity and took it. That she's here because of the ranch, not because... He stopped, looked deeply uncomfortable. That's not what I think, he added quickly. Or Hector. I'm just telling you what's going around. The kitchen was quiet for a moment. Lily set the papers down very carefully. Her hands were flat on the table. Her face was doing the thing where it went completely still. And Caleb had learned in 2 weeks that the stillness was not absence, it was the opposite of absence. It was the face she made when something had hit home, and she was deciding in real time whether she was going to let it show. How many people heard it? She asked. Her voice was perfectly level. Feed store was maybe 8 men, Davis said. And Holt told it to Margaret Yates separately, I heard. So, he stopped. It'll be most of the town by tomorrow. Lily nodded, just once. Thank you, Davis, she said. That'll be all. He put his hat on and left quickly, clearly relieved to be out of the room. Lily sat at the table and did not move for 30 seconds. Caleb stood against the counter and watched her, and did not say anything, because there was nothing useful to say in those 30 seconds. Then she picked up the papers again and looked at Garfield's response. We go to the Callahans today, she said, as planned. Lily, it changes nothing about what needs to happen. She looked up at him, and her eyes were the clearest and most direct they had been in 2 weeks. Clear in the specific way of a person who has decided not to break. He put the rumor out now because he knew we went to the records office together. He wanted to discredit me before Garfield gets here and before we talk to the neighboring ranchers. He needs people to doubt my credibility before I can build any. She paused. Which means we need to build it faster than he expected. Caleb looked at her steadily. You're not going to let it show. I'm going to deal with it, she said. Which is different. She stood and picked up her coat. Get the horses. He got the horses. The Callahan place was 6 miles north, a mid-sized operation run by a man named Patrick Callahan, who was 60 years old, built like a man who'd spent every one of those 60 years doing physical work, and who had a handshake that communicated immediately that he was not interested in wasting time. He also had a wife, a woman named Nora, who had white hair and sharp blue eyes, and who sized Lily up in about 4 seconds from the porch when they rode in, and whose expression moved from wariness to something considerably more engaged in the space of a single conversation once Lily started talking about the water rights documentation. Patrick Callahan sat in his front room and listened to Caleb lay out the situation with Everett Holt and Lily supplement that with the specifics of the county records and the Helena inquiry. He listened without interrupting. When they finished, he sat quietly for a moment. Holt offered me a shared use agreement on my southern water line 18 months ago, he said. Said it was neighborly, Said I'd be better off having it formalized. He looked at his hands. I signed it. Lily kept her expression neutral, but Caleb felt the air in the room change. What was in the agreement? Lily asked. Said the water access from my South Creek was shared use between my property and any adjacent land to the east. Patrick paused. Holt bought the property to my east 3 months later. Lily was quiet for a moment. Do you have a copy of the agreement? Somewhere. I'd like to see it. Patrick looked at her for a long moment, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful assessment of a man who had been burned once and was checking the temperature of the fire before he got closer. Then he looked at Caleb. The water situation on your place, Patrick said. Is it the same kind of arrangement he's trying to build? It's the same method, Caleb said. He wants me to believe I need his permission to use water that's documented as mine. Then he'll offer an agreement. And once I've signed the agreement, supersedes the original documentation. Patrick Callahan sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. When he looked back down, his face had something in it that was older than anger, something tired and certain. My son's place is 2 miles east of mine, Patrick said. He signed a grazing rights amendment with Holt last spring. I told him not to. He paused. He thought Holt was being generous. Lily looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Patrick. How many properties in this valley has he done this to? Caleb asked. Patrick shook his head slowly. I've been wondering that myself. And that was the moment, sitting in Patrick Callahan's front room on a cold November morning, when Caleb understood that what Everett Holt was doing was not a dispute between cousins. It was not a water rights case or a family grudge. It was a systematic patient operation to control every significant water source in the valley. One signed agreement at a time until the moment arrived when every rancher within 15 miles of Hargrove woke up and discovered they'd signed away the thing they needed most. And Caleb was the one who'd noticed it. Caleb and the woman sitting beside him with 11 pages of notebook and a clarity of mind that had seen it from the outside when none of them inside had been able to see it at all. How many ranchers in this county do you trust? Lily asked Patrick. Patrick thought about it. 6, 7. Men who've been here long enough to have built something worth protecting. Would they talk to Caleb? He looked at Caleb again. A long look, the kind that is also a question. Then he nodded slowly. If I brought him to them, yes. Lily sat back. Then that's what we do before Garfield arrives. We don't just file the Anderson rights confirmation. We document every arrangement Everett Holt has made in this valley. We build a complete picture. She looked at Patrick steadily. Not just for the county court, for the ranchers themselves, so they know what they've signed. Patrick was quiet for a long time. Nora Callahan came in from the kitchen with coffee that no one had asked for, and set it on the table, and sat down herself, which meant she'd been listening from the other room and had decided she was now part of the conversation, and Patrick watched his wife sit down and didn't say a word about it. All right, Patrick said finally. I'll make some introductions. On the ride back to Anderson Valley, the afternoon cold coming down off the ridge and their breath visible in the air. Lily was quiet for the first mile. Then she said without looking at Caleb, He's done this in other counties. Caleb looked at her. What makes you think that? Because he's too practiced at it. The way he layers it, the narrative first, then the offer, then the agreement that supersedes the documentation. That's not something a man figures out on his first try. She kept her eyes on the road. He came to this county knowing how to do this because he'd done it somewhere else. Caleb thought about that, about where Everett had been before he started acquiring land in Hargrove County. About the years of Everett's life that Caleb actually knew nothing specific about beyond the general outline of prosperity and acquisition. I don't know where he was before, Caleb admitted. I might be able to find out, Lily said quietly. Garfield has contacts at the Territorial Land Board. If Everett has filed anywhere else in Montana, there'll be a record. Caleb looked at her. She was still watching the road, but there was something in her profile that set of her jaw. The stillness she carried that he was beginning to understand was not coldness. It was the concentrated warmth of a person who had decided that something mattered enough to fight for, and who was directing every degree of that warmth at the problem, rather than at making anyone feel comfortable. I thought about what Davis had told them that morning, about Everett's words at the feed store, about the way a rumor moved through a small town, and the way it shaped the air around a person, made them visible in a particular way, cast a light on them that was not flattering, and not fair, and not easily argued against, because it was made of implication, not fact. "What he said about you," Caleb started. "Don't." Her voice was not sharp, but it was final. "Lily, I've dealt with worse," she said. "I'll deal with this. What matters right now is Garfield's arrival and the Callahan introduction." She paused. "Don't spend energy on what you can't change." "I can change it," he said. She turned to look at him then, and something moved in her face, something quick and unguarded, like a door opening for a half-second before it was pulled shut again. "How?" she asked. He thought about it. About how a man changed a rumor in a small town. About what carried weight. About the things that were documented, and the things that were witnessed, and the things that were simply said plainly, and in front of people by a man whose word meant something. "I'll tell the truth," he said, "in front of whoever needs to hear it." Lily looked at him for a long moment. The wagon moved beneath them, and the cold air came off the ridge, and somewhere south, a hawk was moving in wide circles against the white sky. "People don't always want the truth," she said. "These ones will," he said, "when they understand what Everett's been doing to all of them." Another long moment. Then Lily turned back to the road. She didn't say he was wrong. That was something. By the end of the third week, 6 ranchers had agreed to share their documentation with Garfield. Patrick Callahan had made 3 introductions personally, driving Caleb out to properties he hadn't visited in years, sitting in front rooms and kitchens and saying plainly, "This is my neighbor. He's trying to hold. What's his? And I think Everett Holt has been working on all of us. Tell him what you signed." The Watkins family. Thomas and his wife Clara, who had nothing to do with the Clara who had sent the letter, but whose name registered briefly every time Caleb heard it, had signed a water access amendment 3 years ago, and had been wondering ever since why their east pasture felt increasingly like borrowed land. The Sorensens had a grazing rights note from 2 years ago that had language in it. Lily spent 40 minutes reading and rereading before she looked up and said very quietly that it was the most elegantly structured piece of property extraction she had ever seen, which was not a compliment. Garfield arrived on a Wednesday, 2 days ahead of schedule, with a briefcase and a coat that was expensive, and a mind that was sharper than his mild manner suggested. He sat with Lily for 3 hours the first evening, going through the Anderson documents and the notebook and the correspondence from the land board, asking questions in a quiet, precise voice, and nodding at her answers with the nod of a man who is checking what he already suspected against what the facts are actually saying. After the 3 hours, he sat back and looked at Caleb. "Miss Bennett," he said, "has done work here that most attorneys would charge a considerable sum for, and not do half as well." He paused. "Where did you find her?" "She came to me," Caleb said. Garfield looked at Lily. "And you're not an attorney?" "No," she said. "Have you considered it?" A long pause. "Once or twice." She picked up the notebook. "What do we need to file first?" They worked through the evening and into the night, and at some point, Lily fell asleep in the chair across from the fire, with the notebook still open in her lap, and Garfield looked at her for a moment, and then looked at Caleb, and said nothing at all, which somehow communicated everything. Caleb got up and put a blanket over her shoulders, and went back to the table and kept working, and did not think about the fact that she hadn't woken up, that she'd let herself sleep, that after 3 weeks of operating at a controlled distance from anything that might be called ease, she had, in the lamplight of his kitchen with the fire going low, let her guard down far enough to sleep. Outside, the November wind was building towards something serious. The first real promise of winter coming off the mountains. Inside the Anderson farmhouse, with Garfield's papers covering the kitchen table, and Lily's notebook lying open on her knees, and 38 head of cattle in the barn, and the whole weight of the valley balanced on what the next few weeks would bring. Caleb Anderson sat in his kitchen and felt for the first time in a very long time that he was not facing it alone. The thought arrived quietly without ceremony, And Caleb let it stay. Let it sit in the kitchen alongside the lamplight and the papers and the soft sound of Lily breathing in the chair, and he did not examine it too closely, because some things, once you start turning them over in your hands, lose the shape that made them matter in the first place. Garfield left on Thursday morning with the Anderson survey documentation, copies of 6 neighboring ranchers' amended agreements, and a list of filings he intended to pull from the Territorial Land Board in Helena. He shook Caleb's hand at the gate, and then turned to Lily and shook hers with equal deliberateness, which was the kind of small gesture that meant more than it appeared to in 1882 Montana. "I'll have the formal rights confirmation ready for county court filing within 10 days, Garfield told them. "I'll telegraph when it's done." "And the other properties?" Lily asked. "That's a separate matter, and a larger one. What I file for Anderson Valley won't solve the Callahans or the Sorensens. But it will establish a documented record that their attorneys, if they retain them, can point to." He paused. "What you've assembled here is the foundation of something that could unravel everything Everett Holt has built in this county. He knows that. He will not wait quietly." Then he rode out, and Caleb and Lily stood in the yard in the cold morning air and watched him go, and Lily said without looking at Caleb, "He's right. Everett's next move will be personal. You said that before. I'm saying it again because this time I mean it more specifically." She turned to face him. "He couldn't stop the legal filing. He knows that now. So he'll go after the one thing he thinks he can still damage. My credibility. Your relationship with me," she said. The words were plain and direct, and she delivered them the same way she delivered financial projections, factually, without emotion. In the front of them, though, Caleb was learning to hear what lived behind her voice when she spoke like this. He'll tell the story that benefits him. A woman with no family, no local ties, arriving under questionable circumstances and taking up residence on a bachelor rancher's property during a legal dispute. He'll frame everything we've done together as improper. He'll make the court question whether your decisions have been sound." Caleb looked at her. "And how do we answer that?" Lily held his gaze for a moment. Then she said something he hadn't expected. "I've been thinking about that since yesterday evening." A pause. Garfield mentioned before he left that the county court hearing will require character witnesses. People who can speak to the legitimacy of the operation here, the decisions made, the standing of everyone involved. Patrick Callahan already said he'd speak. Patrick Callahan is one voice. Everett will counter with 6. She folded her arms against the cold. "We need the town, Caleb. Not just the ranchers, the town. The people who see you every week, who know what Anderson Valley is, and what it does, and what kind of man runs it." She paused. "And they need to see me clearly before Everett's version of me becomes the only one they have." That was the morning Caleb understood that the next fight was not in the county records or at the bank or in Garfield's filing. It was in the town of Hargrove itself, in the feed store conversations, and the Sunday church steps, and the moments between people who had known each other for years, and were now being asked quietly and relentlessly by Everett Holt's careful social machinery to decide what they thought about Lily Bennett. He went into town alone that afternoon. He stopped at the feed store first, which was where Holt had done his talking. There were 4 men in. When Caleb walked in, 2 he knew well, one he knew in passing, and one he didn't recognize. He picked up the supplies he needed, and then he stopped at the counter, and he talked. Not a speech, not a defense. He talked the way he had always talked, which was plainly and without a lot of extra words about what was happening at Anderson Valley. About the water rights documentation. About Garfield. About the neighboring ranchers and what they'd found in their own signed agreements. He let the facts do what facts do. When they're put in front of honest people, he let them land. The man he knew well, a rancher named Bob Fielding, who'd bought land east of town 8 years ago, listened the whole time and then said slowly, "Holt came to me last spring about my south fence line." "Did you sign anything?" Caleb asked. "I told him I'd think about it." Bob's jaw worked. "I'm going to look at that paperwork tonight." The man Caleb didn't recognize turned out to be a cattle buyer from Billings who was passing through and had no stake in any of it, and he listened to the whole conversation with visible interest and then said to no one in particular, "Sounds like what a fellow named Pendleton tried in Cascade County 4 years ago." Bought land, systematically built up water agreements, then leveraged them when people needed credit. He paused. It went to court. Took 2 years. He lost. Caleb looked at him. Pendleton. Leonard Pendleton. You could look it up. The buyer settled his hat. I'm just saying it's not a new trick. He left, and Caleb stood at the counter with that name sitting in his chest like a coal. Pendleton. Cascade County. 4 years ago. I was back at Anderson Valley by late afternoon, and he told Lily what the buyer had said, and Lily went very still in the specific way she went still when something important had just connected to something else important. Pendleton, she said. You know the name. I know the case. She sat down at the kitchen table. I was in Billings when it went to court. I remember it because the property manager at the ranch I worked, he'd been approached by Pendleton's operation a year before, didn't sign, warned others. She looked up at Caleb. The methodology was identical. Narrative first. Dependency story. Voluntary agreements superseding documented rights. She paused. Pendleton lost the court case. He left Cascade County. He moved. The silence between them was very quiet. Where did he move? Caleb asked. Lily looked at him. Garfield, she said. I need to send Garfield a telegram tonight. She was at the telegraph office in Hargrove before 7 o'clock, and the reply from Garfield came back the following morning, and it confirmed what they had both already started to believe. Leonard Pendleton had left Cascade County in disgrace in 1879 and had resurfaced in Hargrove County in 1880 under a different name with money from sources that had never been made public and a new face for the same operation. The name he was using in Hargrove County was Everett Holt. Caleb read the telegram sitting at the kitchen table, and then he read it again. Lily sat across from him and watched his face and did not say anything while he took it in. He's not my cousin, Caleb said. His voice was very quiet. He presented himself as your cousin. My mother had a sister. Her son left Montana when I was 12. I've never met Everett Holt as a grown man. I knew him as a child. He set the telegram down. Anyone could claim the connection. Anyone who knew enough about my family. Lily leaned forward. How long has he been operating in Hargrove as your cousin? 3 years. He came back, or someone came back, claiming to be him 3 years ago when my father was already gone, and there was no one left to verify the family connection. He knew enough details, family names, history. Caleb stopped. His hands were flat on the table. I never questioned it. Why would I? Because he counted on the fact that you wouldn't, Lily said. Not unkindly, but without softening it. That's the foundation of the whole arrangement. If you believe he's family, you're slower to fight him. You second-guess yourself. You look for a way to resolve it quietly. She paused. He used your decency against you. The anger that moved through Caleb then was the specific kind that comes not from being attacked, but from being underestimated, from discovering that someone looked at you and concluded that your good faith was a weakness to exploit. It was a cold, focused anger, the kind that doesn't shout. The kind that gets very quiet and very clear and stays that way. We need to take this to the county court, he said. We need to take it to Patrick Callahan first, Lily said. And the Sorensens, and the Watkins. Every rancher who signed an agreement with Everett Holt needs to know who they actually signed with before this goes in front of a judge. She met his eyes. If Garfield files the rights confirmation and we say nothing about the Pendleton connection, Holt can still operate. He'll lose the Anderson water rights case and pivot. But if we expose who he is before the hearing, the whole structure collapses at once. It also gives him time to run. I know. She looked at him steadily. How fast can you get word to Patrick? He was already standing up. Caleb rode to the Callahan place in under an hour, pushing the horse harder than was strictly comfortable in the cold. And Patrick Callahan read the telegram from Garfield, with the particular stillness of a man who has been patient for a long time and is now seeing the thing he was patient about resolve into its true shape. Nora stood beside him and read it over his shoulder, and her face went from shock to something considerably harder. Leonard Pendleton, Patrick said. You know the name. I knew a man in Billings who lost his ranch to Pendleton. He folded the telegram with precise movements like he was being careful not to damage it. This is the same man. Garfield has documentation linking the methods. He's working on the financial trail where Holt's acquisition money actually came from. If it's from parties connected to the Pendleton operation, that's fraud on top of the property claims. Patrick handed the telegram back to Caleb. What do you need from me? I need you to call the ranchers together, everyone who's dealt with Holt, before the weekend. We present this together, the county clerk, the court, the sheriff. We don't give him time to move his assets or change his story. Patrick looked at his wife. Nora was already untying her apron. I'll send Thomas Watkins and his boy to the Sorensons, Nora said. Patrick, you go to the Hendersons and the McGregor place. That covers everyone. She looked at Caleb with those sharp blue eyes. You go back to that young woman at your ranch and you tell her she was right about all of it. Caleb almost said she's not, and then stopped, because the correction he'd been about to make, she's not a young woman at my ranch. She's collapsed under the weight of trying to explain what Lily Bennett actually was to Anderson Valley, and to him specifically, and he decided the explanation would take longer than he had right now. I'll tell her, he said and rode back. He found Lily in the barn, checking on the cattle, which she did at this time every afternoon, regardless of what else was happening, because the cattle needed checking, regardless of what else was happening. And that was a fact about Lily Bennett that Caleb had observed and quietly admired for 3 weeks, that she never let the crisis consume the ordinary work, because the ordinary work was what you'd have left when the crisis resolved. She listened to him report what Patrick had said and what Nora had organized, and when he finished, she stood for a moment looking at the nearest cow with the unfocused gaze of someone thinking through consequences. When everyone knows, she said, Holt will know we're moving. He has people in town who talk to him, someone at the feed store probably, maybe someone at the post office. She turned to face Caleb. We have maybe 48 hours before he has the full picture and decides whether to fight or disappear. If he disappears, does that end it? For the ranchers, not entirely. The agreements they signed are still legally present until they're challenged or voided. But it removes his ability to pursue the Anderson water claim, and it opens the fraud investigation. She paused. For you, yes, it ends it. And for the other ranchers, she looked at him. Something moved in her face that was not quite a smile, but was in the neighborhood of one, the expression of a person who appreciates when someone asks the right question. That's why we do it together, she said. Not just for Anderson Valley. He looked at her in the barn in the cold November afternoon, and he thought about the woman who had stood on a train platform 3 weeks ago with dust on her boots, and a letter that wasn't hers to carry, and had done it anyway. And he thought about 11 pages of notebook and 4 hours in a records office and a letter to Garfield written at midnight, and an anger that had never once curdled into bitterness. And he thought about his father's box of documents and the ranch that was still standing because someone had come and seen it clearly when he couldn't. I thought about Everett Holt looking at Lily on the first visit and seeing a tool and what it said about a man, that was what he saw when he looked at her. Lily. He said her name the way you say a thing when you've been not saying it for long enough that it finally just comes out. She looked at him. Her expression was careful, open in that small controlled way she had, like the cracked door. I didn't have the right words organized. He'd never been good at organizing those particular words. So he said what was true in the plainest form he could find. I don't know what this ranch would look like right now without you. And I don't mean the legal strategy or the records or the feed costs. He paused. I mean the way you are here, the way you work, the way you... He stopped. Tried again. I started to think about 30 days ending, and I don't like the shape of that thought. Lily was quiet for a long moment. The barn was quiet around them, just the animals and the cold air and the low afternoon light coming through the door. Caleb, she said. Her voice was careful, not closed. Careful. I've spent 4 years being no one's anything. I've kept it that way because it's easier. Because the things you attach to are the things that can be taken from you. A pause. I know, he said. I know all of that. He held her gaze. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm just telling you the truth, the same way you've been telling me the truth since you stepped off that train. I thought you deserved it. Another silence. Longer this time. Lily looked at the cow she'd been checking on, then down at the hay at her feet, then back at him, and the thing that moved across her face in that moment was something he hadn't seen there before. Something young and undefended and almost frightened, which on a woman who had never frightened easily meant that it mattered, that it genuinely and specifically mattered. "I'll think about it," she said. It was the same thing she'd said about staying for 30 days. He nodded. "That's enough." The meeting of the Valley Ranchers happened the following evening at the Callahan barn. 6 families plus Caleb with Garfield present, via a letter that Patrick read aloud in sections, because the man read clearly and without dramatics, which was exactly the right approach for what the letter contained. The Pendleton documentation, the financial trail, the false identity, the pattern of acquisition that had played out identically in Cascade County 4 years before. Thomas Watkins got up in the middle of the 3rd page and had to stand outside for a few minutes. His wife went with him. When they came back in, Thomas Watkins had the face of a man who had swallowed something very hard and was deciding not to let it stop him. "I trusted him," Thomas said. "Not to the room in particular. Just saying it the way you say things that need to be said out loud to become real. I sat across a table from that man, and I trusted him." "So did I," Patrick said. "So did I," said Martin Sorensen from the back. The room was quiet for a moment, with the weight of that shared thing. The particular shame, that's not really shame, but feels like it. The shame of having believed something that turned out to be constructed. Caleb knew the feeling. He'd been carrying it since the telegram. Lily, who had come with Caleb and had been sitting quietly near the back of the room for the entire reading, spoke then for the first time. She didn't stand up. She spoke from where she sat in a clear voice that carried without effort. "What he built," she said, "required you to be trusting, required you to be people who took a man at his word, required you to believe in fair dealing because you practice it yourselves." She paused. "That's not a weakness. That's what he hunted. Men who didn't hunt back." The room took that in. "The agreements you signed," she continued, "can be challenged now that the fraud is documented. That's a separate legal proceeding from the Anderson water rights case, and each of you will need individual counsel. But the foundation, the documentation of who he actually is, and what he's actually done, that's what tonight is for. That's what we bring to the sheriff and the county court together as a group, so that no one man is standing alone against an attorney who knows this county's procedures." An older rancher named Henderson, who had been quiet through the whole meeting, looked at Lily with the direct assessment of someone who has been listening very carefully and wants to make sure they have it right. "Who are you exactly?" he asked. Not unkindly. "She's the woman who pulled the Anderson water rights documentation from the county records," Patrick Callahan said before Caleb could answer. "And who found the Pendleton connection before any of the rest of us knew there was a connection to find." He looked at Henderson. "That's who she is." Henderson looked at Lily for another moment, then nodded in the manner of a man who has received a satisfactory answer and intends to move forward. The group agreed to go to the sheriff the following morning together. 6 families. Garfield's documentation. The Pendleton record. The false identity claim. They would go as a unit, and they would file as a unit, and they would stand in that sheriff's office as people who had stopped collectively looking at the problem from inside it. On the walk back to the wagon, in the cold dark outside the Callahan barn, Caleb fell into step beside Lily, and for a moment neither of them said anything. Then she said quietly, "Henderson's question." "You answered it fine," Caleb said. Patrick answered it. "Because it was true." She was quiet for a few steps. "It was kind of him." "It wasn't kindness," Caleb said. "It was accurate." Another few steps of quiet. "Caleb." She stopped walking. He stopped with her. The night was fully dark and very cold, and the stars above the ridge were sharp and close, the way they get at altitude in November, and she turned to look at him with that expression that had been building and pulling back for 3 weeks now. "When Garfield files, when the sheriff takes the complaint, when this is resolved." She stopped. "When it's resolved," he said very carefully, "I'd like you to still be here." She looked at him. "Not because of the ranch," he added. "Not because of the cattle or the books or the feed costs. Because—" He stopped again, And then with the particular decisiveness of a man who has spent 32 years being careful and has decided to stop being careful about this specific thing, he said, "Because I would like to know who you are for longer than 30 days." The wind came down off the ridge and moved between them. Lily Bennett, who had ridden 4 days on a train to deliver someone else's bad news, who had organized 11 pages of county records and restructured a feed supply chain and written a letter to an attorney at midnight and sat in a room full of ranchers and told them plainly that their decency was not their failure. That woman stood in the cold Montana dark and looked at Caleb Anderson, and something in her face did the thing it had been carefully not doing for 3 weeks. It opened. "I don't have anywhere I need to be in Cheyenne," she said. "The job there I wrote and declined it 3 days ago." Caleb went very still. "When did you—" "3 days ago." Her voice was level, but her eyes were not entirely steady. "I'd already decided. I just hadn't—" She stopped. "I hadn't said it yet." He looked at her. In the cold and the dark, with the stars above the ridge and the sound of the other ranchers moving toward their wagons behind them, and all of it, the water rights and the false cousin and the 30 days and the train platform and the yellow flowers that had gone into the creek that same night because he hadn't known what else to do with them, all of it present and real and accounted for. "Then stay," he said. Lily looked at him for one more long moment. "All right," she said. And she walked to the wagon, and he walked with her, and they rode back through the dark toward Anderson Valley. And the cold was still the cold, and the problems were still the problems. But the shape of the night had changed the way a room changes when someone you didn't know was missing walks back into it, and you realize only when they're there again how quiet it had been without them. The sheriff's office in Hargrove. The next morning held more people than it usually held in a month. 6 families. Caleb, Lily, and Garfield's 8-page documentation, which Patrick Callahan carried in a leather folder and set on the sheriff's desk with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict rather than reporting a crime. Sheriff Alderman was a careful man, methodical, not easily moved. He read every page. He asked questions. He sent a deputy to the telegraph office twice. He was on the 3rd reading of the Pendleton court record from Cascade County when his deputy came back with a return telegram, and the sheriff read it and set it down on the desk and looked up at the room full of people watching him. "Holt's property manager filed a motion with the county court at 8 this morning," Alderman said, "on behalf of Everett Holt, requesting an emergency injunction on the Anderson water rights filing." He paused. "The motion includes an affidavit from 2 named witnesses stating that Anderson Valley has been operating under irregular management arrangements and that the decisions of the current operation are compromised by the influence of an unnamed outside party." The unnamed outside party. Every person in that room knew exactly who that meant. Caleb felt Lily go very still beside him. Then, before anyone could speak, before Caleb could say what was already forming in his chest, "Patrick." Callahan straightened in his chair and said in the voice of a man who had decided something permanent, "I'll be a witness for Caleb Anderson and for Miss Bennett, and I'll bring every name in this room with me." Thomas Watkins said, "Same." Martin Sorensen said, "Same." Henderson, who had asked, "Who are you exactly?" the night before, said simply, "Same." Sheriff Alderman looked at the room, then at Caleb, then at Lily. His expression was the controlled expression of a professional man who is taking stock of a situation and rendering a private judgment that he will make into a professional one. "I'm going to need to bring Holt in for questioning," he said, "today before that court motion goes any further." He looked at his deputy. "Ride out to the McCready place. Bring him in civil." The deputy left. The room breathed. Lily, who had not moved and not spoken since the sheriff read the telegram, finally turned and looked at Caleb. Her face was very still, but her eyes were doing the thing he was learning to read. The thing where what she was actually feeling was in there present and specific if you knew where to look. "He filed this morning," she said quietly. "He knew we were at the Callahans last night." "Yes." "He moved fast." "So did we," Caleb said. She looked at him for a moment. Then very quietly she said something he did not expect. "I'm scared." Not of Holt. He understood that immediately. Not of the injunction or the court or any of the procedural mechanisms that she'd been navigating for 3 weeks without apparent fear. This was something else, something closer and more particular. The fear of a person who has just said all right to something that matters and is now aware of how much it would cost to lose it. He reached over very simply and put his hand over hers where it rested on the bench. She didn't pull away. Outside, a horse started and then moved away down the street toward the McCready place and in the sheriff's office in Hargrove, Montana, in November of 1882. 6 families and 1 rancher and 1 woman who had arrived on the wrong train sat and waited for the shape of things to declare itself, which it did not slowly and not gently, in the way that things declare themselves when they have been held back long enough that the pressure of them has become its own kind of force. The deputy came back in 40 minutes. Everyone in that sheriff's office heard the horse before the door opened, and the quality of the silence that followed the sound of a single horse. Not too arriving at the hitching post was the kind of silence that tells you the answer before anyone speaks. The deputy came through the door and looked at Sheriff Alderman and said in the flat voice of a man reporting a fact and not a judgment, "He's gone. The McCready place is cleared out. Colton, too. Neighbor says he saw wagons moving before dawn." The room absorbed that. Caleb felt it land in his chest. Not relief. Not yet something more complicated. The specific sensation of a threat dissolving before it could be met directly, which should feel like victory, but felt instead like unfinished business. Like a conversation that ended before the last thing got said. Lily's hand was still under his. She turned it over briefly and pressed his fingers once, not a romantic gesture, something more practical than that, more grounded. And then she straightened and looked at the sheriff. "The court motion he filed this morning," she said. "Does his departure affect it?" Alderman leaned back in his chair. "A motion filed without a party present to pursue it is a motion that dies in procedure. Judge Harmon will dismiss it within the week when Holt fails to appear." He paused. "The larger question is the fraud claim. If he's crossed county lines, that becomes a territorial matter, and territorial prosecution is slower and less certain." "Will you file?" Patrick Callahan asked. "I'll file everything I have today and telegraph the territorial marshal in Helena by this afternoon," Alderman said. "Whether he's caught is beyond this office. What this office can do is make sure the record is clean and complete, so that wherever he surfaces, there's documentation waiting." He looked at the leather folder Patrick had set on his desk. "That documentation, Garfield's letter, the Pendleton record, the financial connections, that goes in full with my filing." Thomas Watkins let out a long breath. "And our agreements, the things we signed. With the fraud documented and Holt's false identity on record, those agreements are challengeable in county court. You'll need individual filings. Garfield can advise on the process." Alderman looked at Thomas directly. "They won't unravel overnight, but they will unravel." The room moved. Then people standing, hands being shaken. The particular energy of a group of people who came in braced for a fight, and are now managing the strange deflation of not having had to throw the punch they'd been cocking back for days. Relief and leftover tension, and the practical questions of what came next, all moving through the room at once. Lily stood, and Caleb stood with her, and as they moved toward the door, Patrick Callahan put a hand briefly on Caleb's shoulder. Just for a second. The hand of a man who doesn't gesture easily and means it when he does, and said nothing because nothing needed saying. Outside, the morning was bright and sharp cold, and the main street of Hargrove looked exactly the way it always looked, which struck Caleb as slightly remarkable, given how different everything felt from the inside of his own chest. He stopped on the boardwalk, and Lily stopped beside him, and they both stood there for a moment, not saying anything. "It's not finished," Lily said. "Not a complaint, just accurate." "I know." He looked at the street. "The February note. The spring projections. The formal rights confirmation still needs Garfield to file. All of that." She paused. "But the immediate threat is gone." "Yes." Another pause. "You should feel good about that," she said. There was something in her voice, not quite an instruction, more like permission. Like she was telling him it was all right to let the held thing down. He looked at her sideways. "Do you?" She thought about it with the seriousness she brought to everything. "I feel like I can breathe at a normal depth again." She almost smiled. That might be the same thing. He thought that might be the same thing too. They rode back to Anderson Valley, and Caleb made coffee, and Lily sat at the kitchen table and opened the notebook again, because the notebook apparently never fully closed, and began writing a summary of what had happened at the sheriff's office, and what needed to happen next in the specific order it needed to happen. Caleb watched her do this, and thought about a thing Garfield had said before he left. "Where did you find her?" And his own answer. "She came to me." He thought about how a man's life could be arranged in such a way that the thing it most needed arrived through a door. It hadn't expected carrying news it didn't want, and how you could either close the door on that, or hold it open and see what followed the news inside. He was very glad he'd held the door open. "The bank," Lily said without looking up from the notebook. "You need to go to the bank this week, not to negotiate, to inform. You go in and you tell them that the water rights confirmation is being filed by Garfield, that the fraud case against Holt has been opened, and that the February note will be met on terms you intend to present in writing before Christmas." Before Christmas? Before Christmas. She looked up. "You're not going to them in February with a problem. You're going to them in December with a plan." "Those are completely different conversations, and I've been saying this since the beginning." "You have," he agreed. "Then go to the bank." I went to the bank on Thursday alone, because Lily said clearly that this particular meeting was one where she should not be present, not because she couldn't handle it, but because this was the meeting where Caleb Anderson, standing in his own community, needed to speak for itself, and she was precise enough about these things to understand that her presence, given the stories Everett had put into circulation, would make the conversation about her instead of about him and the ranch. I didn't like it, but he understood it. The bank manager was a man named Forsyth, who had been in Hargrove for 15 years, and who had a professional caution about him that Caleb had always read as coldness, and was now starting to wonder if it was just precision, the same quality Lily had only applied to ledgers instead of land. Forsyth heard everything Caleb laid out. The water rights documentation, the Garfield filing, the Pendleton fraud case and Holt's departure, the restructured feed arrangements and their effect on operating costs through winter, the spring cattle projections, which Caleb had written up himself the previous evening, with Lily going through them line by line, asking him questions, until every number on the page had a specific reality behind it. Forsyth looked at the projections for a long time. Then he looked at Caleb. "These projections," he said, "you prepare them yourself, with help." Caleb paused. "Miss Bennett, the woman managing ranch operations, she's managed operations before. She knows how to build a realistic projection. The numbers are conservative." Forsyth looked at the paper again. "Conservative is what I like to see." He set it down. "The February note can be extended at current terms to April if you come in before year-end with the Garfield confirmation in hand. That gives you the spring calving results to apply against the balance." A pause. "I want the water rights confirmation from the county court clerk, not just Garfield's letter." "You'll have it." Forsyth looked at him with the level eyes of a man who is deciding one final time what to believe. "Anderson Valley has been on this land for 20 years, he said. "Your father never missed a payment until the hard winter. You missed one. That's a different record than a man in chronic trouble." He paused. "I should have offered this extension when you first came in struggling. I didn't because I was waiting to see which way the Holt situation resolved." He said this with the flat honesty of someone making an acknowledgement that costs him something. That wasn't right. Caleb looked at him steadily. "No," he said. "It wasn't." A pause. "But I'll take the extent." Forsyth almost smiled. "April, with the clerk's confirmation." "April," Caleb said, "with the confirmation." He rode home with the agreement in his coat pocket, and the particular lightness of a man who has been carrying a weight long enough that he'd forgotten what it felt like to be without it, and who is now rediscovering with each step the horse takes how much of himself had been going toward holding that weight instead of everything else. When he walked into the kitchen and told Lily what Forsyth had said, she stopped writing in the notebook and looked at him. "April," she said. "April." She nodded once and this was the thing he would remember longest. She let out a breath that was not entirely controlled. A breath that had some relief in it, that she hadn't meant to show quite that plainly, and she looked down at the notebook and said quietly, and to the table, rather than to him, "Good." He sat down across from her. "You were worried." "I'm always worried until the thing is done." "You don't look worried." "I know." She looked up. "I learned a long time ago that looking worried doesn't help anything." He thought about that. About what it had taken to learn it. About the ranch her father had lost, and the years she'd spent managing other people's land, because she couldn't get back to her own, and the particular kind of containment a person builds around themselves when they've learned that the world will take what they love if they hold it too visibly. "You can look worried here," he said. "If you need to, it won't change anything." She looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in her face, something older than the notebook and the projections and all the careful competence. Something that had been there under all of it waiting. "I know," she said again. But this time it sounded different. The formal hearing at the county courthouse in Millbrook was set for the second week of December, which gave Garfield time to complete the rights confirmation filing, and gave the county clerk time to formally process the fraud complaint that Sheriff Alderman had submitted. Judge Harmon had dismissed Holt's emergency motion the same day. Alderman's filing landed on his desk, which Garfield had telegraphed to confirm with the particular satisfaction of a man reporting that something has gone exactly as it should. But the hearing was not only about the water rights. Caleb understood this when the summons arrived, and he read the details and brought them to Lily, who read them herself, and then set the paper down and said in a voice that was carefully even, "He left someone behind." The summons named a proceeding that included, in addition to the water rights confirmation, a formal inquiry into the management and operational standing of Anderson Valley. Whether the property had been properly managed over the preceding months, and whether the individuals responsible for its management were acting in legitimate good faith. Everett Holt might have fled the county. But his attorney, a man named Breck, who operated in Millbrook, and who apparently had not received the message that his client was gone, had filed on Holt's behalf before the departure. And a motion once filed had its own life in the court system, regardless of who had filed it. He set this in motion before he left, Lily said, knowing that even if he had to go, the motion would still run. Can Garfield counter it? Garfield will counter it, but the hearing will still happen. She looked at Caleb with those direct eyes. They'll ask me to testify about who I am, where I came from, how I came to be here, why I stayed. I know. They'll make it a question of whether I had legitimate purpose here, or whether I was... She stopped. Whether you were what Everett told them you were, Caleb said. Yes. He looked at her steadily. Then we answer the question. She looked back at him. You understand that answering it means, I know what it means. He held her gaze. I'll say exactly what's true, all of it, in front of whoever needs to hear it. I told you I would, and I meant it. A long pause. Caleb. Her voice was very quiet. What's true is not a simple thing. What's true is that I came here to deliver a letter, and you offered me work, and I took it, and somewhere in the course of 30 days... She stopped again, looked at the table, looked back at him. What's true is complicated. No, he said. It's not. He leaned forward slightly. You came here honestly. You worked honestly. You saved this property out of something that was not self-interest. If it were self-interest, you'd have been in Cheyenne 4 weeks ago. What you did here you did because it was right, and because you couldn't help seeing what needed doing, and because... He stopped. Because that's who you are. That's the whole of the truth. It's not complicated at all. Lily looked at him for a long moment that felt like something crossing. Something wide, like a river that once you've crossed it, you don't go back from the other side. All right, she said, barely above a breath. All right, he said. The night before the hearing, Nora Callahan came to Anderson Valley uninvited and knocked on the door and came in with a covered dish and the air of a woman who had decided something and was going to do it, whether it was convenient or not. She set the dish on the table and looked at Lily with those sharp blue eyes. I want to tell you something, Nora said, before tomorrow. Lily stood in the kitchen and looked at this woman who had organized an entire valley of ranchers' families in one evening and said, "All right. I've lived in this valley for 30 years, Nora said. I have watched 6 women arrive in this county as mail-order brides, and I have watched what happened to each one. 3 of them built something real. 3 of them didn't. You know the difference between the ones who did and the ones who didn't." She paused. "The ones who did came here knowing that a person isn't a rescue and a marriage isn't a transaction. They came here understanding that what they were walking into was work. Real work. The kind that takes everything you have, and they were willing to put what they had into it." She looked at Lily directly. "You didn't come here as a bride. You came here as a person. And then you did the work anyway. More of it than most." A pause. "I wanted you to know that I'll be in that courtroom tomorrow, and I'll say so." Lily stood very still. Her hands were at her sides. Her face was doing the thing it did when something had hit the place underneath all the competence, the place she kept very quiet. "Mrs. Callahan," she started. "Nora," the woman said. "And you don't have to say anything. I didn't come for your gratitude." She picked up her coat from the chair where she'd set it. "I came because tomorrow there will be people in that room who've only heard Everett Holt's version of you, and I want them to have heard mine first." She walked to the door. "Eat the dish. It's better warm." And she left. Lily stood in the kitchen for 30 seconds after the door closed, not moving. Then she turned and Caleb was there leaning in the doorway between the kitchen and the hall, and he had clearly heard every word. She looked at him. "Don't," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "I wasn't going to say anything," he said. "Good." She turned and lifted the cover off Nora's dish, and the steam came up, and the smell of it was warm and familiar. And she stood over it for a moment with her hands on the counter and her head slightly down, and Caleb watched her from the doorway and did not say anything, because she'd asked him not to, and because some moments are exactly the right size when they're left alone. The Millbrook Courthouse on the second Thursday of December held more people than the county clerk had seen at a civil hearing in years. Patrick Callahan and his wife, Thomas and Clara Watkins, Martin Sorensen, Henderson, 2 of the other ranchers from the Valley meeting, Sheriff Alderman, Garfield, who had ridden from Helena and looked calm in the specific way of a man who has done this many times and is not concerned. Nora Callahan in the second row with her hands folded and her blue eyes pointed at the front of the room like a compass pointing north. And in the gallery scattered among the faces, Caleb recognized from Hargrove a number of people he knew had heard Everett Holt's version of Lily Bennett and were here because they were curious or skeptical or both. Breck Holt's attorney was a compact man with a careful face who had clearly done the math on his client's absence and was adapting to circumstances. He was not incompetent. Caleb could see that immediately. He was going to do what he'd been retained to do, and he was going to do it professionally, which was in some ways more difficult to answer than outright hostility. Judge Harmon was 60, white-haired, and had the efficient patience of a man who has long since stopped being impressed by anyone's drama and is exclusively interested in what the documentation says. Garfield presented the water rights confirmation first. It took 11 minutes. The survey documentation, the 1861 addendum, the county records, the rejected Holt inquiry from 18 months ago, the Pendleton fraud filing and its connection to the present case. Harmon asked 3 questions. Garfield answered them with the precise economy of a man who knows he is correct and does not need volume to prove it. Breck raised 2 objections. Harmon overruled both without evident deliberation. Then Breck stood and requested the court's attention to the matter of operational legitimacy at Anderson Valley. And the room's energy shifted in the particular way it shifts when the thing that everyone knew was coming finally arrives. Breck called Lily to testify. She walked to the front of the room with the same stride she used for everything, even unhurried, not performing either confidence or submission. She sat in the chair provided and looked at the judge and then at Breck and gave both the same level attention. Breck asked her to describe how she had come to be at Anderson Valley. She told him, plainly in order, without embellishment and without minimizing. The letter, Clara's request, the train from Kansas, the platform, the conversation, the work offer, the 30 days that had become more than 30 days. She did not apologize for any of it, and she did not over-explain any of it, and the courtroom listened with the particular quality of attention that appears when someone is simply and directly telling the truth, in a place where truth has been in question. Breck asked whether she had any formal connection to the Anderson property prior to her arrival. None, she said. He asked whether she had any documentation of her work history and credentials. She named the Billings operation, the foreman's name, the owner's name, the years of service, the specific nature of her work. Garfield had already submitted the letter of reference from the Billings owner which Harmon had in front of him. Then Breck asked with the careful precision of a man laying a trap he has built slowly. Miss Bennett, is it your testimony that your decision to remain at Anderson Valley beyond your original purpose was entirely professional in nature? The courtroom went very quiet. Lily looked at Breck for a moment. Then she looked at Harmon. No, she said. Breck's expression shifted a very small controlled shift of satisfaction. Would you explain what you mean? He asked. It started as professional, Lily said. It became personal. I stayed because the work needed doing, and because... She paused for just a moment, and it was a pause that the entire room felt. Because I came to care about this ranch and the man who runs it. Those things aren't in conflict with each other. The work was real and legitimate, regardless of what I felt, and what I felt developed because of the work, because of who he was in the work. That's not a compromised arrangement. That's how people come to know each other when they're both honest. The room held what she'd said for a long beat. Harmon looked at her over the top of his papers. Breck gathered himself and asked with somewhat less confidence than before whether she could confirm that no financial arrangement or property interest had influenced her decision to remain. I can confirm it, she said. I have no financial stake in Anderson Valley. I have no claim on the property. I came with a canvas bag and a 4-day train ticket, and I've added nothing to my material situation in the time I've been here. A pause. What I've added is not material. Breck looked at his papers. He asked 2 more questions that accomplished nothing and then sat down. Harmon looked at Garfield. Anything further? Garfield stood. 1 question for Miss Bennett, Your Honor, if it please the court. Harmon nodded. Garfield looked at Lily with the expression of a man who has prepared this question very precisely. Miss Bennett, in your assessment of Anderson Valley's operations over the past month, is the property financially sound? Yes, she said. With the February note extension and the spring cattle projections, I've documented Anderson Valley is not only sound, it's better managed right now than it has been in 3 years. The restructured feed arrangements alone reduced operating exposure by 31%. She paused. The ranch is solid. The man running it is solid. I'd stake my professional reputation on both. Garfield sat down. Harmon looked at the room. He looked at the documentation in front of him. He looked at Breck. The motion questioning operational legitimacy at Anderson Valley is dismissed, Harmon said. The water rights confirmation for the Anderson property is granted as filed. This court finds the documentation of fraudulent identity and systematic acquisition fraud sufficient to refer the matter to the Territorial Marshal's office for further proceeding. He closed the folder in front of him. We're done here. The room moved. Caleb was on his feet, and so was Patrick and Thomas Watkins, and the sound of people standing and talking was immediate and warm. And through all of it, Caleb kept his eyes on Lily, who had stood from the witness chair and was standing at the front of the room with her hands loose at her sides, looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of someone who has just put down something very heavy and is still getting used to the lightness. He crossed the room to her. She looked up when he reached her, and her eyes were the clearest he had ever seen them. No calculation in them, no assessment, just present and direct and his. You said it in front of everyone, he said quietly. I said what was true. You said you cared about the man who runs it. I said that, yes. He looked at her for a moment. Around them, the courthouse was full of motion and voices. Garfield gathering papers. Patrick shaking someone's hand. Nora Callahan moving through the room like she owned it. I care about you, he said, simply, without managing it. I have for some time. I wanted to say it here in front of the same people you said it in front of so it's documented equally. Something happened in Lily's face that was entirely unguarded for one full second. Something luminous and half frightened and completely real. "That's the most practical declaration I've ever heard," she said. "I'm a practical man." "You are." Her voice was quiet and had something warm buried in it that she wasn't trying to suppress. "That's one of the things." She stopped. "Then, one of the things I care about." He reached out and took her hand. Not the brief practical press from the sheriff's office, but fully with intention in front of Patrick Callahan and Nora and Thomas Watkins and the entire population of Millbrook Courthouse who wanted to look. She let him. And in that moment in the courthouse in December, with the cold coming through the windows and 30 days behind them, and what felt like the rest of everything ahead, Lily Bennett, who had come to Montana carrying someone else's news and had ended up building something entirely her own, stood in the warmth of being seen clearly by one honest man, and held on, which was the thing she had not let herself do in 4 years. The thing she had trained herself out of because holding on meant having something to lose, and she had lost enough to know that the cost of it could be more than a person could afford to pay twice. But she held on anyway in the Millbrook Courthouse in December, with the cold at the windows and Caleb's hand solid and warm around hers, and she thought, if this is the thing that costs me, then it costs me. Some things are worth the price of them. The ride back to Anderson Valley that afternoon was nothing like the ride they had taken in November, the one where the land had been cold and unknown, and the silence between them had been the silence of two careful strangers. This silence was different, full rather than empty. The kind of quiet that settles between people who have said the important things and don't need to fill the space with anything lesser. Hector and Davis were at the barn when they pulled in, and Hector looked at Caleb's face, and then at Lily's, and then back at the barn, without a word, which was exactly the right response. Davis opened his mouth, and Hector said something very quietly to him that made him close it again, and they went back to work. And Caleb felt the particular warmth of being known by people who had watched the whole thing unfold and had their own opinion of how it should end. Inside Lily put the kettle on without being asked, because she always put the kettle on when they came in from cold. And Caleb sat at the kitchen table and looked at the room at the table where the papers had lived for a month, at the chair where Garfield had sat at the window, where the winter light came in gray and clean, and felt the strangeness of a crisis that had ended. Not the absence of work. Work remained, would always remain. But the particular weight of fighting for survival had lifted, and what was left was just the ranch and the winter and the woman standing at the stove with her back to him and her coat still on, because she hadn't thought to take it off yet. "You should take your coat off," he said. "You're staying." She looked over her shoulder at something in her face that was almost a smile, the real kind, the kind she didn't produce for general consumption. She took her coat off. 3 days after the hearing, a letter arrived from Clara Weston. It was addressed to Caleb, forwarded through the Hargrove Post, and Lily brought it in from the mail with the rest, and set it on the table without comment. Caleb saw the return address and looked at it for a moment, and then looked at Lily. "Go ahead," she said in the voice she used when she was being deliberately neutral about something she was not entirely neutral about. He opened it and read it, and then put it flat on the table and was quiet for a moment. "Well?" Lily asked. She was looking at the notebook. She was not looking at the letter. "She heard about the hearing," he said. "From someone who passed through Dodge City." He paused. "She says she's glad Anderson Valley is secure. She says—" He stopped. Read the relevant passage again. "She says she thinks she made the right choice, for both of us." Lily was quiet for a moment. Then she looked up from the notebook. "Do you think she did?" He looked at her across the table, at this woman who had come in through a door he hadn't opened, expecting anything, who had reorganized his finances and his legal situation and his understanding of his own land, and in the course of doing all of that, had rearranged something considerably more interior that he didn't have a precise accounting term for. "Yes," he said. "I think she did." Lily held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the notebook. But her mouth had done the thing, the almost smile that was more honest than most people's full ones, and she didn't try to stop it. He folded Clara's letter and put it in the box with his father's documents, which felt like exactly the right place for it. Christmas came to Anderson Valley quietly. The way Christmas comes to working ranches acknowledged, but not elaborate, because the cattle needed feeding on Christmas the same as every other day, and the pipes needed watching in the cold, and the morning came early, regardless of what the calendar said. But Nora Callahan appeared on the 24th with food that was clearly far too much for just Patrick and herself to eat, and Patrick came with her and brought a bottle of something that he said was for medicinal purposes, and that Davis, who was 20 and not always wise, took at face value until Hector quietly redirected him. They ate at the big table in the Anderson farmhouse, all of them, Caleb and Lily and Hector and Davis and Patrick and Nora, and the conversation moved the way it moves at tables where the people around them have been through something together easily, with the particular warmth of shared history, doubling back and filling in and making each other laugh at the things that had been frightening 2 months ago, and were now with enough distance occasionally absurd. Davis, who had been asking careful sideways questions for 3 weeks about the situation between Caleb and Lily, and had never gotten a direct answer from either of them, finally looked at Nora Callahan and said in the slightly emboldened voice of a young man who has had a small amount of something medicinal, "Mrs. Callahan, do you think they're going to get married?" The table went quiet. Nora looked at Davis with the expression of a woman who has decided to be kind to a question that did not entirely deserve it. Patrick looked at the ceiling. Hector looked at the window. Caleb looked at Lily. Lily looked at Davis with those level dark eyes for a long still moment, and Davis began to understand that he had perhaps said something that he should have kept as a thought. Then she said, "Davis, go check on the horses." Davis went to check on the horses with considerable speed, and when the door closed behind him, Patrick Callahan made a sound that was very definitely not a laugh, and Nora covered her mouth with her napkin, and Hector allowed himself quietly to smile. Caleb, who was still looking at Lily, said nothing. Lily, who was now looking at her plate, said nothing, but color had come up in her face in a way that was entirely honest and entirely new, and Caleb thought that was the most information he'd received in a single moment in quite some time. January moved through the ranch with the steady cold industry of a Montana winter, the work unrelenting, the days short, the nights long and quiet. Lily had settled into Anderson Valley the way water settles into land that knows how to receive it completely without dramatic announcement, in a way that made it difficult to remember exactly what it had looked like before. She had a system for the morning feeding that Hector adopted without discussion because it was better than the previous one. She had a way of reviewing the weekly accounts that meant Caleb always knew exactly where the numbers stood without having to ask. She had a chair at the kitchen table that had become without formal designation, her chair and a side of the workbench in the barn that was organized the way she organized things, and a handwriting that appeared regularly in the margins of the operations notebook alongside his. She was woven into the place. She had done it herself, thread by thread, and he had watched it happen with something that was beyond gratitude and considerably beyond respect, and that he had been building towards saying plainly for weeks. He said it on a Thursday evening in January, with the fire going, and the notebook closed for once, and the ranch quiet outside, and he said it the way he did everything plainly, without ornament, with the full weight of meaning it. "Lily, I'd like to marry you." She looked up from the book she'd been reading, a practical guide to winter cattle management that she'd borrowed from Patrick, and that she read the way other people read novels with genuine absorption. She looked at him across the fire for a long moment. "I know," she said. He waited. "I've known for a while," she said. She set the book down. "I've been thinking about how to answer." "How long have you been thinking?" "Since Christmas Eve." A pause. "Since Davis asked the question." Something moved in Caleb's chest that might in a different kind of man have come out as a laugh. "That's 3 weeks." "I think carefully." "I know you do." She looked at the fire for a moment. When she turned back to him, her face had the openness that he had learned to recognize as the thing she allowed when she was being completely honest. The face without the careful management, the face that was just her. "I'm not afraid of the work," she said. "I've never been afraid of the work. She stopped, started again. "I spent 4 years making sure I didn't need anyone, making sure that if something was taken from me again, the damage would be containable." A pause. You are not containable damage, Caleb. If I marry you and something goes wrong, it will not be containable. He looked at her steadily. I know, he said. Same. She blinked. You think I'm not afraid? He asked. I waited 6 months for a woman I'd never met because the idea of needing someone specific and losing them was easier to manage at a distance. She was safe. Letters are safe. You are not safe at all. He paused. You are the most specific, most particular, most entirely herself person I have ever known, and yes, that is terrifying, and I would like to marry you anyway. The fire moved between them. Lily looked at him for a long time with those dark eyes that had looked at him clearly from the very first moment on the platform and had not stopped being clear since. Yes, she said, just that. One word said plainly the way she said everything that mattered. He let out a breath that had been building since Thursday evening in the sheriff's office when she'd reached under his hand. Yes, he said back, just to say it. They were married in March, when the worst of winter had passed, but the mud season hadn't fully arrived in the yard of Anderson Valley, on a morning that was cold and bright, with the kind of light that comes off Montana snow in the late season, sharp and clean and particular. There was no minister from a city. The minister was Reverend Alcott from the Hargrove Church, a practical man who kept the ceremony short because he understood that the people standing in front of him in the cold did not need a performance. Patrick and Nora Callahan were there. Thomas and Clara Watkins. Martin Sorensen. Hector stood beside Caleb in the way of a man who has been asked to stand there and feels the weight of it and is glad to carry it. Davis stood next to Hector and managed with considerable visible effort not to say anything at the wrong moment. Garfield had sent a letter from Helena that Patrick read aloud before the ceremony, which was a typically Garfield thing to do, formal and warm at once, noting that the Anderson water rights were now fully confirmed in the county record, that the territorial marshal's investigation into Leonard Pendleton had resulted in an arrest warrant that had been served in Wyoming 3 weeks prior, and that it was his professional opinion that Anderson Valley would stand for another 50 years without difficulty. He wished them both well in language that was precise and genuine, and made Nora Callahan press her hand briefly over her eyes. When Reverend Alcott asked Caleb if he took this woman, Caleb said, I do, in the same voice he used for everything, no special register, no performance. The voice of a man who means what he says. When he asked Lily, she was quiet for just a moment. Not hesitation. Everyone present understood. It wasn't hesitation, and then she said, I do, in a voice that was steady and clear and contained beneath its steadiness everything she had carried to this ranch and everything she had found here and everything she was choosing now with the full and deliberate weight of a person who thinks carefully and means it completely. Caleb put the ring on her finger, a simple band his mother's, which he had kept in the box with the documents, and which fit as if the world had arranged for it to fit. Lily looked at the ring on her hand for one long moment. Then she looked at him. He had seen her face in many configurations by now. The working face, the thinking face, the careful face, the almost smile face. He had seen her frightened and angry and exhausted and precise, and occasionally in unguarded moments, quietly joyful in the way of someone who does not trust joy to last and is therefore careful not to need it. He had seen all of those faces. He had not until this moment seen this one. Open all the way down, unmanaged present. Her whole face at once. I thought it was the most honest thing he had ever seen. She reached up with her free hand and put it flat against his chest. Not a dramatic gesture, just that her hand. There feeling his heart going, and he put his hand over hers, the same way he had in the sheriff's office, and Reverend Alcott said the words that made it official, and the small crowd of people who had watched the whole of it happen from the train platform onward made the sound that people make when something ends the way it should. After there was food. Nora had brought food. Of course, it would never have occurred to Nora not to bring food, and the yard was warm with people talking, and the particular ease that follows ceremony when the ceremony was true. Lily stood with Nora near the barn door, and Caleb watched from across the yard as Nora said something to her, and Lily laughed. Actually laughed the real one, the one that came up without management, and he thought about the woman who had rehearsed her speech on a 4-day train ride, who had stood on a cold platform and said, You chose the wrong bride with her spine straight and her hands full of someone else's news, and who had then, through some arrangement of circumstance and character, and the particular stubbornness of two people who were both too honest to pretend, become the only answer to the question he hadn't known how to ask. Davis appeared at Caleb's elbow. He had been good all morning. He had not said anything at the wrong moment. He appeared to be building toward something. "Mr. Anderson." Davis started with the careful formality of a young man who is about to attempt a sentiment. "Davis," Caleb said, "I just wanted to say I'm glad she stayed." Caleb looked at him. "So am I." Davis nodded with the profound relief of a young man who has successfully said a true thing and survived it, and went back toward the food table. Hector materialized briefly at Caleb's shoulder in the way he had silent approach measured departure. "Good day," he said. Just those two words. Then he was gone. Caleb looked at Anderson Valley, at the barn and the fencing and the eastern pasture where the creek ran, documented and confirmed, at the farmhouse with its 2 stories and its kitchen, where the papers had lived for a month, at the bunkhouse and the land rolling toward the ridge and the sky above it, clear and enormous and indifferent in the way of Montana sky, which does not care about human arrangements but makes a fine backdrop for them. High had built this. His father had started it, and he had continued it, and for 2 years he had held it by force of will against bad seasons and bad luck, and a fraud that had worn a family face, and now he stood in the yard of it on a March morning with the ring on his wife's finger, confirmed in county record, and the water rights confirmed in county record, and the February note restructured to April, and the spring calving coming, and 38 cattle in the barn that would be more by summer. And he thought about what it meant to hold something, what it actually meant. Not just the legal fact of it, not just the documented survey and the confirmed addendum. The real holding, the kind that requires another person alongside you, someone who sees the thing as clearly as you do and is willing to put their hands into it with you. He had not known he was missing that until it arrived on a train platform with dust on its boots and a crumpled letter and the most direct gaze he had ever received from another human being. Lily came back across the yard toward him, leaving Nora to organize something that Nora had decided required organizing. She stopped beside him and looked out at the land the same direction he'd been looking, and they stood there together in the cold, bright morning without saying anything for a moment. Then she said, "The east fence on the north pasture section needs attention before the mud comes." He smiled. He couldn't help it. "I know. Hector can take Davis and get the post set this week if the ground doesn't freeze again. I'll tell him. And the second supplier in Millbrook, I want to renegotiate the spring terms before March is out. We have more leverage now than we did in November. We have more everything now than we did in November." She looked at him sideways, the almost smile. "Yes," she said. "We do." He reached over and took hand, simply, completely. The way he'd done in the courthouse, the way he intended to keep doing, and she led him the way she had, then the way she intended to keep doing. The people of Hargrove County told the story for years afterward. The man who waited for a mail-order bride. The wrong woman who stepped off the train. The words exchanged on a cold November platform that no one who was present ever quite forgot. And what came after the fraud dismantled the valley's ranchers made whole. The land confirmed the 2 people standing in a courthouse holding hands in front of everyone who needed to see it. They told it as a story about luck, about fate, about the particular mercy of things going wrong in ways that turn out to be right. But the people who knew Hector, who had watched it from the beginning, and Patrick and Nora, who had understood what they were looking at before either of the principals did, and Davis, who had learned something important about asking questions at the wrong moment, those people knew it wasn't luck. It was 2 people who chose every single day in the full knowledge of what it cost and what it risked to be exactly who they were, and to see each other exactly as they were, and to build something real on that ground, rather than something easier on less honest soil. That was not luck. That was the whole of it. That was everything. And Anderson Valley stood, and the creek ran documented and clear through the eastern pasture, and the cattle came in strong that spring. And Lily Bennett Anderson kept the notebook and the accounts and the east fence, and the man who had held yellow flowers on a train platform in November, and had, without knowing it, been holding them for her all along, and neither of them ever had cause to regret a single day.